Hey guys, it's Mitch. How's it going? I'm alive! This is the first video I've recorded in almost 2 months, so excuse me if I'm a little bit rusty. I had kind of a involuntary sabbatical I had to kind of go on there for a while. But that's all taken care of now, so I can get back to recording these. And we're going to start things off by looking at the beginning of the Punisher ongoing series from 1987 here. This is a book I've wanted to look at for a little while. I mean, for a couple of reasons. For one thing, it's interesting to look at the early iterations of this character, where they obviously wanted to cash in on the growing trend of grim and gritty superheroes, but they had to do it within the frame of the Comics Code Authority. So that's an interesting kind of source of tension there. For another thing, I just have early memories of old Punisher comics, particularly the first couple of issues. And those kind of left a bit of an impression on me. Like, I'm talking about when I was maybe around 7 or 8, so obviously I was familiar with what comics were, but my experience with comics up until that point had been like early 80s of The Amazing Spider-Man, or, I don't know, I remember having an issue or two of the Batman and the Outsiders, that sort of thing. So, that would have been the picture I would have had. And the Punisher would have been a pretty stark contrast to that. So this is a series that is, I think, pretty heavily influenced by the post-1986 vibe that was going out after the release of Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen. It was also following his appearance in Daredevil during Frank Miller's run, which apparently kind of redefined the character. Up until that point, Punisher, he was introduced in 1974 as a villain of the week. About all they had on him was that he was an assassin with, maybe some kind of tortured past. And then Frank Miller decided to use him for, all of 2 issues as sort of an ideological foil to Daredevil. Because Daredevil represents the whole superhero thing, the ideological thing, where he's committed to upholding justice, but more the idea of justice in the form of, established law. Whereas the Punisher is in pursuit of a far less ethereal version of justice. He's not trying to appease a non-existent father figure. He's trying to get revenge and make sure that the shit that happened to his family doesn't happen to anybody else, or as happens to as few people as he can affect. And his appearances in the Daredevil comic apparently kind of influenced how the Punisher was used going forward, where he would be more of an ideological foil. So you throw him in the ring with guys who have some kind of established, maybe kind of naive ideology, such as Daredevil, such as Spider-Man, such as Captain America, where once it's established, yeah, you can work within that framework, but if you kind of zoom out and look at vigilantism as a whole, it doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense, other than this is a character in a kid's book. You don't need to get too realistic with the motivation. Of course, Frank Miller wasn't having that shit. Frank Miller wanted the character in Daredevil strictly so that he could test the strength of his main character's beliefs. And yeah, that was kind of a watershed moment for the character. In the couple of years after those issues, Punisher appearances started happening a little bit more frequently, and they tended to boost the sales of the books that he was appearing in. To the point where Stephen Grant and Mike Zeck put together a pitch for a Punisher series, which apparently didn't go over too well. Marvel Editorial wasn't convinced that the character could hold his own series. They figured this was a flop waiting to happen. But there was enough interest that they would authorize a miniseries. This was the Punisher miniseries by Stephen Grant and Mike Zeck mostly. That would focus solely on the Punisher character and be much more grim and gritty, would have more of a psychological aspect to the character, would tell everything from his perspective. So, we're finally seeing things through Frank's eyes, and he would be a protagonist that would be more fitting to a mid-80s audience. So we're thinking like in the Schwarzenegger-Stallone era. And Marvel apparently still kind of underestimated the potential for the character. So the first issue, they didn't print too many copies. And apparently that shit sold out pretty much immediately, to the point where the direct market was, they were having trouble tracking copies down. And the series was a pretty wild success. So immediately they greenlit a regular series to be written by Mike Baron and drawn by Klaus Janson. So again, in the post-Dark Knight era, when Marvel's got to be thinking to themselves, man, all those DC properties, they're doing gangbusters over there. I wish we had some grim and gritty stuff that we could peddle. It's like, well, we do have what is essentially a Frank Miller character, because Frank Miller redefined the character. And we also have Dark Knight's inker, who can certainly pencil well enough to do his own book. Why don't we give that a shot? And, this series, of course, it pretty quickly became one of Marvel's most successful ongoing series. on the strength of the grim and gritty tone that everybody was looking for, particularly the direct market. But I mean, also on the strength, I think, of some great art. You know, like the early Klaus Janson issues, I think they look great. Klaus is a good storyteller with a very recognizable style. That certainly helps. That was followed pretty quickly thereafter by Will Sportasio in some of his earliest works, followed by Eric Larson, and then over on Punisher War Journal, Jim Lee was doing his stuff. So you had a lot of those guys who would eventually break off to Image doing the early dirty work on the Punisher character. So anyway, that's enough lead-in. Like I said, I'm a little out of practice, so I just kind of got into the research a little bit on this. Let's get right to the issue here. We can start with the cover. That's a pretty goddamn good one. I think this is a pretty iconic cover for Punisher #1. Big hero shot of the main character. Get a nice Dutch angle. I think Klaus Janson likes his Dutch angles. We're going to see a few of those over the course of the issue. Keeping it street level, which would be a focus at least for the early days of the Punisher character, but they wanted to move him pretty quickly to like international crime, so taking down drug cartels and terrorist rings and white supremacists and shit like that. And he's got the closest thing to a giant Liefeld-type gun that you can get while still keeping it fairly realistic, in that he has a bazooka. This is in the pre-Liefeld days, but still, it does look a little bit Liefeldy. I appreciate it. And, you know, interesting thing they're doing with the colors here. A lot of secondary colors here. Purple to green to orange. That's an interesting mix. I feel like I haven't seen that too often, really. I mean, you know, with the stuff that I usually look at anyway. And, you know, good figure here, nicely highlighted too. It's a mostly dark figure against what's essentially a pure line work background. And, you know, nice details on the background. Pop them out a little bit against the title here. I don't know how common that was in the pre-Image Guys days. No, I think that's a really successful one. All right, so we're going to start things off. This is going to look very much like, I imagine it's going to look very much like Daredevil in the post-Frank Miller days, because Klaus Janson did take over penciling duties, well, I think penciling and inking duties for a while there. So we're going to start things off with Frank walking down the street in a trench coat with a fedora. It's going to be a little while, I think, before the Frank Castle character is really established. So this early version of the character is kind of interesting, and where he's like Mike Barron's trying to find a voice for the character, and I feel like it takes him a little while to find it. So here he, he does have the first person, like hard-boiled kind of perspective, but he also has kind of a sarcastic tone. And, like, you see him be kind of charismatic over the course of the issue, which, he would hold up over this series. But it is still kind of weird back in these early Comics Code days. So he's walking down the street. Crack addict jumps out of an alley and mugs him. And, I mean, they're specifically talking about crack. This is another code-approved book. But, you know, we're past the days where Stan Lee couldn't get a story about Harry Osborn hooked on drugs past the Comics Code Authority, so he published it anyway. You know, and that kind of instituted a whole bunch of changes. So now, yeah, you can totally talk about crack in a comic that can be sold on the newsstand now. Punisher hands over his wallet, gets stabbed for his trouble, and then ends up laying in the alley here. And that's the end of the Punisher regular series. No, I'm kidding. No, he was ready for this, so he came with a Kevlar vest, which, to the best of my knowledge, does not stop knives very well. It's not what it's designed for. But, you know, kids in 1986, they probably don't know that. I think probably Mike Barron knows that. Mike Barron strikes me as a guy who probably read a whole lot of military fiction growing up. You know, as far as I can tell, he was never in the military himself, but his description and his dialogue does have some of that realistic feeling like a Chuck Dixon has. You know, not so far as reading a Larry Hama comic, where he has to give you the specifications on the ammo type that everybody's using, as well as the full name of the weapon, and where you might get it, how much it costs, who you would speak to. So, I mean, you know, you would think in a story where we start off with Frank Castle getting jumped by a mugger, theoretically that mugger should be dead right away, except, of course, that Frank Castle he was looking to get jumped by a crack addict specifically so that he could follow the crack addict, because crack addicts don't look over their shoulder after they stab a dude, and he could find the local crack house. So this is the inciting adventure for our new comic periodical. And, you know, now naturally he's got to take a moment to get himself prepped, and we get a nice big splash page of the main character here. In what is still kind of a silly outfit, really, in 1986. I mean, you know, like, this is kind of a middle ground between, I think, what they wanted the character to be and what the comics code would like a comic book superhero to be. So, yeah, he's got his realistic weapons and gear and all that stuff. He has his grim and gritty inner monologue, but he does still have to dress up in his skin-tight Lycra outfit. And it's interesting seeing this version of the Punisher since, like the one I reread the most is the Garth Ennis Punisher Max version. I think that's as good a version of the character as there has ever been, and probably really will be, particularly given how Marvel is these days. So yeah, like knowing that version and then, reading this where, he spots the crack house and goes, okay, don't go away, gentlemen, I'll be right back. It's a short walk to the locked dumpster I dropped here 2 days ago. Have to dress for the party and pick up the party favors. Got my invitation and everything. He's got to be a little bit witty. Arnold and Stallone can be witty. Why not Frank Castle, right? That was another focus of this ongoing series, apparently, where the miniseries was more about kind of a deep dive on the character itself and really just kind of getting down to that street level and seeing what a proper vigilante can do in the Marvel Universe. This is more of a B-movie. Yes, the character is going to be more methodical and he is going to be lethal, but we don't need to get too hung up on the nitty-gritty details about the inner workings of Frank Castle. Certainly not right off the hop. So he kicks things off by telling us that rock houses are built to withstand small arms fire and handheld battering rams. The LA cops have had some success with a modified tank. No one's ever tried an armor-piercing rocket. So Frank's going to break some new ground here. That's a great-looking fucking panel. As he blows like the front of the house straight off, I guess. And then uses like a grappling gun. Some nice little small panels for storytelling. And then swings in through a window while everybody's recovering. And he says, knock, knock. Well, hey, that's Arnold's line. You can't steal those directly. And then we get a quick, sidestep, butta. And he's pretty much taken everybody out already. He left one alive. So now he gets to question the one guy. So we're going to still steer away from gore because, we do still have, the Comics Code Authority still has some kind of standards you have to adhere to. That would go away quickly in the years following this. But right now, you can't show any kind of gore. So he picks up the one live guy, puts the gun in his mouth in kind of a pretty Dark Knight-looking panel here, and gets the guy to tell him who owns the joint, who's in charge, how he can find him. And Junkie here says, sure, why not? He figures that, his boss is going to kill Frank anyway, so might as well. Frank turns to leave. He is actually going to leave him alive, as he says here, don't like to pull the trigger in cold blood, not if I can help it, but guy reaches for a gun as he's leaving, so we're going to be a little bit oblique, but, he does throw a knife at him and then pick it back up again. Like I said, they're kind of walking a tightrope in these early issues where they have to figure out exactly what the line is on what they can show and, what they're, they got to kind of find a comfortable rhythm. Because you have to have bloodshed in a Punisher book, but you can't show any of the bloodshed. So then we're going to get Frank's modus operandi, which is how he's going to be operating going forward. There's a strong box filled with cash and a kilo of coke. The coke goes into the East River on the way to my warehouse in Jersey. So whenever he knocks over a crack house or, any kind of criminal enterprise, he's going to kill all the bad guys, he's going to destroy all the drugs, and he's going to keep all the cash to fund his war to, so he can do it again tomorrow. So we get back to the warehouse. Frank has a name for who he's going to be going after next. And then we're going to do a cut to the Vietnam War Memorial. It's a little bit unclear as to when this is happening, whether this is, I guess this is after the rock house he just busted. And he's going to use the information he got from the rock house in conjunction with the information he's going to get here. Really, he's just here to kind of visit the wall and kind of see if he recognizes any of the names. But while he's there, he actually ends up running into an old squad mate. They recognize each other and they're going to shoot the shit because this version of Frank isn't really that averse to conversation. Which makes sense. In an ongoing book, you probably can't have him be all taciturn and stoic all the time, because that gets a little bit boring when you're reading a book. Unless you have a really good writer at the helm. So anyway, this guy here, Bruce Ayers, he's going to take Frank over to another part of the wall that he hasn't been to yet. Points out a name that Frank recognizes. He's like, shit, I didn't even know he bought it. And Ayers says, yeah, no, that's because he didn't. Ayers says he ran into this guy, Curtis Hoyle, just a little while ago. Ayers is running a charter outfit down in the Keys, and this other guy came up to him, and he's trying to get him in on running coke for him. Very simple, kind of small panels. Like this could be a scene in a movie. We're just kind of keeping everything in a long or medium shot to make sure that it's usually pretty clear where the guys are in terms of the landscape. So we're going to show them approaching the stairs, walking down the stairs, and just kind of wandering around the memorial in general. So they don't quite cover why Hoyle's name was up on the wall when he is still alive, but maybe we'll find that out later on in the series. Ayers here does ask Frank, I don't know, what do you think I should do? Should I take him up on it? Because as far as he knows, they're both just kind of vets, who are maybe not down on their luck, but they're just kind of trying to find, make their way in a post-war world. And Frank just flat out says, yeah, no, stay away from it. And he's like, yeah, no, I'm probably getting too old for that kind of shit. So then a couple of days later, Frank ends up calling Ayers back. They made arrangements to maybe meet up later. And turns out Ayers is dead. Ayers ate a bullet. They flat out say suicide, which again is a thing that they couldn't do prior to the Punisher miniseries, really. It's an interesting thing. The Punisher miniseries seems to have been kind of a watershed moment, and that it really kind of lessened the impact of the comics code. The book got so popular, particularly with the direct market. The direct market didn't give a shit about the comics code. So the code could still, enforce some kind of authority, but they couldn't be too rigid in how they enforced the current code. Because if they just, kept rejecting issues that Marvel sent to them, Marvel would just stop bothering with the code, and they'd focus more on the direct market, and the code would kind of lose any kind of punch. If you're not actually enforcing anything, you don't have a purpose. And the Punisher miniseries had stuff like suicide. They had a little girl get shot somewhere in the middle of that series. And all those issues are code approved. But again, the series was getting huge attention. And Marvel was publishing that thing whether or not the code logo was on it. So they had to just kind of toe the line to just kind of keep their shit going. It's an interesting kind of role reversal from 1954, Anyway, back to the Punisher. So Punisher is going to go seeking out the dude who was the boss for that crack house, or for the local crack houses. He's going to be at some kind of gala, so I guess he's fairly high ranking. He is going to bring a sidearm, but more because, this is going to be a meeting for a bunch of drug bosses. They're going to be expecting him to be packing. So everybody's going to be aware of the pistol he's got under his coat, because everybody else is going to have a pistol like that. So to just kind of back that up and give them something that they might not be expecting, he also does some diamond-tipped fingernails. And, he's got to get all dressed up in his tux. Again, this is kind of interesting, knowing the later versions of the Punisher, where there's just no chance you ever see Frank in a tux. They don't make a flak jacket that looks like a tux, And Frank is going to go undercover. So this is the boss guy that he's going to be talking to. This is Wilfred Sobeel, pretty boy and chief coke distributor for Spanish Harlem, arrested for assault, extortion, never convicted. This is his enforcer. He says, this guy I don't know, and I don't think we're going to come back to this guy actually in this issue. It'd be interesting if we do later in the series. And this is Belinda Foster, a former top model, his main squeeze. So he's just going to walk right on up to him and start bandying about Hoyle's name. Hoyle was the guy that he served with back in Vietnam, whose name was up on the wall. And, now he's in the drug running trade. So if he's in the city and he's dealing coke, then he has some kind of a connection to this guy. So Frank's going to act as an up-and-coming drug person. That's an official job description. And he's claiming that he knows who knocked over the crack house just a couple days ago. And he says it was Hoyle. And that he's after Sobeel here's job. So this is a bit too sensitive of a topic for Sobeel to be, discussing out in the open like this. He's going to take Frank to a more secluded part of the club, I guess, that they're at. So we're going to get some just kind of fencing conversation between the two. Frank doesn't have a whole lot of information to go off of. He knows that Sobeel is a big fish in this particular pond, but he also knows that Sobeel has somebody that he reports to, and he needs to know who that is. So that he has a name he can pursue before he starts dropping bodies here. So in the meantime, he's having to get by just on bluster, really, which is a weird kind of feel for the Punisher. But, this is a character that hasn't been featured too often leading up to this. The character itself is 12 years old, but really he's only had a couple of dozen appearances, and they've been kind of all over the place, really, as different writers have different takes on the character. There's been some instances even where he's been characterized as more of a psychopath, where he's been driven literally insane with grief. And really, we're just kind of working off of the miniseries, because that kind of retconned all of that. All the parts where he went too far have been explained away as him having been doped up. So we really only have to work within the framework that was set up within those 5 issues. It's kind of a blank slate. You can do whatever you want with this character. So while they're chatting, this thug here, Damasco, pops in. Frank says this guy's got death squad written all over him. Can't see him taking orders from Wilfred. Has to be someone higher up the ladder. So again, he has to lay back and just kind of wait for further information. So Beale is going to go off and talk, again, more privately with Damasco, and he's going to leave Frank to have kind of an awkward, stilted conversation with his squeeze. And then Sabine comes back, just clarifies with Frank, okay, so Hoyle is trying to take over the New York end of the business. Frank's like, that's what he said. And Damasco here clocks him in the back of the head with what looks like some brass knucks. So something about Frank's story didn't add up. Wakes up a little while later, pretty much naked and tied to a chair. So we're going to get down to some torture again, kind of pushing the boundaries of the comics code. So even in this state, Frank's going to get a little bit of information. Damasco's got him right where he wants him. Frank's like, where are you from, Damasco? Guatemala? And Damasco tells him, I'm Bolivian, I work for the general. And do you know what this is? And he holds up a couple wires. So we're going to get some electroshock therapy. Again, pretty clear storytelling. It's interesting seeing what feels like echoes of like Frank Miller layouts from Daredevil and Dark Knight. Like Klaus has worked with him pretty extensively before this. I feel like the repeated headshots, that kind of has that same feeling, all the small panels. So they're quizzing Frank on what his real identity is, because they figure he's using the name Mr. Messina. They figure that can't be real. Frank doesn't give up his name just yet, but he realizes that the electricity is numbing his hands, so he can't actually work the rope to get himself free. So he has to do something, otherwise they're just going to be able to keep shocking him until either he breaks or he dies. So they shock him again, and he fakes throwing up, like he just kind of lurches forward and starts gagging. So they stop long enough, his hands are still kind of working, and he's got those diamond-tipped fingernails, so he's able to scratch away at the rope. Gets enough of a break, so that, when they're ready to lean back in, Damasco's there first. Frank just grabs him by the throat and grabs the wire out of his hand, shocks him back. Some nice big panels now that the action's picking up. And then we get some kind of silly fight stuff as he flips out of the chair. One of the guys here, I'm not even sure who, comes running at him with maybe a stick. I don't know. And Frank grabs him by the foot, so I guess even though he had the stick, he thought kicking was his best option. And tosses him into some nearby rubble. It's not the best fight stuff, but it's at least it's fairly clear-ish what's going on. Somebody else comes in with an Uzi, kicks that out of his hand, and gorilla presses him. Nice. And then he wins. Okay, it's a little bit unclear, I will say. But we've had a little bit of an action sequence. I guess that makes two kind of action sequences that we've had so far. We're doing all right. It's interesting to note that this is still a matter of establishing a character and, in the context of an action B movie. So you've had your opening action scene that feels kind of unrelated to the rest of it, but, it just sets everything up. And a whole bunch of, basically espionage stuff. And then we get to the torture scene. So these are whack-a-mole plot beats for an action B movie, and when you're trying to establish that your character is a badass. But Frank does get a hold of that last dude's Uzi, and he's able to gun down any remaining guards while he hunts down Sobeel. And Sobeel looks like he's left for an even more private part of the club, or maybe they're at his apartment now. I guess that would make a bit more sense. They took him away from the event they were at. But yeah, no, he's upstairs with his main squeeze. They're just in their underwear. So they were getting down to it when the gunfire broke out. And Sobeel is out of enforcers. He's like, shit, I gotta buy this guy off. What do you want? And Frank goes, I want your job. Sobeel says, you're crazy. You think you kill me? The general will let you live. Frank goes, why not? I can do the job. The general respects ruthlessness. He doesn't know anything about the general, but that's probably a pretty safe blanket statement. And Sobeel's like, listen, you don't have to kill me. I'm finished. I got 250 grand cash in here. I'll toss you the bag. You take it. I'm out of here. New York is yours. So he's abdicating. And he gets his girlfriend to toss the cash out for him at gunpoint. So she does so. She tosses it right in the doorway. Here we get the shadow of what looks like Frank reaching over to pick up the bag. Sobeel's waiting to pick him off when he does that, but Frank was a little bit too clever, used the body of one of the guys that he's already off probably to take the bullets. Sobeel's just shocked that he actually hit something before he gets quickly gunned down. And then, Frank walks in with his gun, and he immediately asks about the money, because that does seem to be kind of a motivating factor for him. It's interesting, because that's an aspect that the later issues, the Punisher Max stuff by Garth Ennis, played down. Like, yeah, the Punisher takes the money, but he doesn't, it feels like he finds that kind of unseemly. And if he wasn't using it to buy bullets to shoot more gangsters, he wouldn't do it. This version of Frank is like, yeah, man, I got to buy beans. Beans aren't free. Also, I got a mortgage on that warehouse. You know how much that shit costs? That's crazy. The girlfriend tells him that there's more money in a safe behind the painting here, and he waits for her to get it because, okay, sure, yeah, get more money. I need that money. So they end up in a hotel room here, just Frank and the girlfriend, and he's going to let her go. He's even going to give her $100,000 out of the cash that he took from, dead Sobil, and then sees her off to the airport and makes sure she gets on a plane so that she's safe. And I guess before he left, he stole Sobil's phone. He did do that. And this is, 1987, where you can't usually get phone numbers from a phone, but they specifically say Wilfred's phone stores 9 pre-recorded numbers. So there's a pretty good shot that somebody in those pre-recorded numbers is somebody further up the food chain. So he goes to a payphone, starts calling numbers. Just leaves a general message on. I think each one says, this is a message for the general. If you're interested in what happened to Wilfred and why, you can reach me at the following number between the hours of, etc. And then he waits by the payphone because you can call those. And eventually the general does call him back at that number. Frank says he wanted to demonstrate that Wilfred was weak and that he wanted his position. General says, you're very convincing, but there are damages now. Frank says, I shall compensate you for damages, and I know how to double your New York distribution. So he's in character now. And the general invites Frank to his hacienda. Says, be prepared to leave tomorrow. I'll send a man to meet you on the library steps. And something about the general's voice sounds vaguely familiar. But in the meantime, that doesn't matter too much because it turns out that the guy that the general sends to meet Frank, to, ferry him over to the hacienda, is Hoyle, Frank's old squad mate that eventually got into drug running. Because he works for the general, that makes sense. So yeah, we got a couple of plot threads that work together rather nicely there. And that's where we're going to end this issue. That's a fairly packed issue in terms of story. Having like first-person narration throughout really helps, particularly in this first issue, because I think most people aren't necessarily too familiar with this version of Frank Castle. Like, they haven't had much of a chance to get very familiar with this version of Frank Castle. So if we actually get his perspective, then, we feel like we know him quicker than we otherwise would have. And I mean, this was hugely popular when it came out, to the point where The Punisher quickly became one of Marvel's biggest selling books. Like, they had to expand the Punisher line immediately. Where, like this time next year, Punisher War Journal comes out. The year following, the Punisher movie comes out. The next couple of years after that, you drop him in as a guest star in any book. That book is going to get a significant bump in sales. And then a couple of years after that, he breaks into a prison in blackface, and that's kind of it. But for like 5 years there, he had a pretty good run. The issue itself, like a fair bit happens. We get to see the Punisher working. We get to see how, how he thinks, essentially. I don't know that it's the most entertaining read, really. But what it did do was it filled a need in that people wanted a book that felt like this more than they necessarily needed this specific book. And just personally, I'm kind of glad I was able to get a copy of this. I feel like this and like Ghost Rider #1 and Infinity Gauntlet #1. Those are the ones that I was willing to spend some money on to get. And it feels like some kind of triumvirate of quality books released in the late 80s to early 90s. They're each kind of landmarks in that I feel like there was uncertainty going into each of them about how successful they were going to be, and they all just blew the fuck up. I feel like this is probably the least of those books, but, I don't give a shit. I'm just happy to have it, and if nothing else, it's got an awesome cover. That can usually do it for you, right? It's a bit of a shame that we're not going to get very many decent Punisher stories going forward unless Garth Ennis decides to come out of hiding again for a little bit. But he's not the most complicated character to have a take on. I'm sure there's plenty of variations on the theme that are very close to the mark for what the Punisher does. So you can usually get that itch scratched. If nothing else, there are like 70 or 80 issues that were written by Garth Ennis over the course of Punisher Max and the various little spin-off miniseries things. So, I mean, it's not like there's any kind of shortage of proper Punisher content out there. So anyway, that should wrap this up. Next one of these videos I put out, I actually recorded before, a little sabbatical here. So that one's ready in the chamber. Maybe doesn't ramble quite as much. And then I can get back to, slowly figuring out how to talk about comics again. We can all look forward to that. In the meantime, that is going to do it for this one. Thanks very much for watching, guys. If you like this video, please hit the like button. It helps with all the algorithm stuff. If you want to see more, hit subscribe. And if you really want to help out, in the description, there's a link to my Patreon. There's a link tree, really. There's links to all sorts of stuff, but listed in there is a link to the Patreon, and that's where you can find everything I do. So all sorts of videos, everything to do with the Blood Force comic. You can also hit me up on Instagram for commissions. And it's been a while since I did the end talk thing, so I forgot I really only have those 3 things to talk about right now that the Blood Force Kickstarter's over. Yeah, I don't know, check out my live streams. Do those twice a week too. That's new information for some people, probably. But regardless, I am awkwardly out as usual. Thanks again for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.